What is a beer style and why do we have them? Well, beers can vary dramatically from one to the other, and styles are an attempt to describe those differences. These variations are created by differences in ingredients. For example, hop varieties, malt varieties, yeast strains, fruits, spices, seasonings, or other additives can vary dramatically from beer to beer, as well as beer color, the alcohol strength of a beer, the fermentation method used to create the beer, and most importantly, the flavor of the beer. Various beers can be very different from one another based on the simple premise that there are a lot of different ingredients that go into making beer. Beer ingredients can include water, malt, typically barley, other grains like wheat, rye, corn, or rice, hops, yeast, fruits, herbs, and vegetables, or spices and seasonings. Depending on which source you listen to, there are at least 23 different major categories of beer styles, and each of those major categories, listed here, can have as many as 8 different substyles included under it. Modern beer terminology has some basic definitions that start to divide beers up into various styles. For starters, today the word beer means an alcoholic beverage based on fermented malt and that normally contains water, hops, malt, and yeast. In centuries past, the word beer had a slightly different meaning, but we'll get into that in a few slides. Ales, lagers, and hybrids are all different types of beer, each one having fermentation characteristics that are different from the other. Ales have been brewed for thousands of years, and there are many more variations of them than for either lagers or hybrids. 16 main categories of ales have been defined. Ales are sometimes called top fermenting beers because the yeast used to make them typically floats on top of the beer, where it converts sugar into carbon dioxide and alcohol. This leaves a foam or layer of bubbles on the top of the beer, and when it happens quickly, it can look like the beer is actually boiling. Ales are also warm fermenting, meaning around 55 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is warmer than the temperatures that lagers ferment at. Lagers were only developed in the 19th century. Prior to that, a lack of understanding of how yeast worked in beer and a lack of refrigeration combined to make the creation of lagers virtually impossible. Lagers are sometimes called bottom fermenting beers, which means that the yeasts sink to the bottom of the beer and do their work of creating carbon dioxide and alcohol there. Lagers also ferment at relatively cold temperatures, usually around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Fermenting at cooler temperatures helps to create a smoother beer than most ales. The word lager actually means to store in German, in reference to the cold aging period that all lagers go through before they are ready to consume. But beer is not entirely black and white, or ales and lagers. There are also shades of gray. We call them hybrids. Hybrids are beers that show some characteristics of both an ale and a lager. For example, some hybrid beers are top fermenting, which is an ale characteristic, but ferment at cold temperatures, a lager characteristic. This makes them a candidate for both ale and lager, but they don't really fit neatly into either category. There are 2 different categories of hybrid beers. There are 23 main categories of beer styles, which seems like a lot, but there are many more different types of beer than that. In fact, the 23 style categories are usually broken down into subcategories, and if you count all of those, there are at least 81 distinct different styles of beer. A few examples of subcategories are listed here for the stout, porter, India Pale Ale, and American Ale main categories. Some of the beer styles you'll find on most anyone's list of different beers are named for countries. For example, an English IPA or an American Stout refer to a country, but that doesn't mean that the beer was brewed in that country. It only means that the style of beer is similar to a style that originated in the country named. It doesn't really matter where the beer was actually brewed. Vienna lagers are rarely found in Vienna these days, but they started out there, and an American IPA could be brewed in Belgium just the same as it could be brewed in America. It's all about the ingredients, the brewing process, and the finished beer. It's not really about geography. In the beginning, there were only ales. Since beer was first brewed many thousands of years ago, humans only knew how to make that type of beer. But over the millennia, beer styles began to evolve as humans developed preferences for one type of ale over another. The evolution of different types of beers is illustrated by ancient references to different types of beer or preferred variations of beer. For example, in 2050 BC in Samaria, there were two styles of ale. We know this based on an ancient tablet that mentions them. Also known from ancient writings, in 1500 BC in Assyria, there were 15 styles of ale. Prior to the use of hops, beer was flavored with a combination of herbs. Today we commonly call this mixture gruit. The herb mixture served to flavor the beer and to balance the malt sweetness. Gruit was commonly flavored with a combination of bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary, although many other combinations existed based on what was available to the local brewer. Gruit began to die out slowly as brewers began to discover the value of hops. Not only did hops add flavor and balance sweetness, but hops also acted as a preservative for beer, allowing it to last longer. Hops slowly began gaining acceptance between the 11th and 16th centuries AD. The first recorded use of hops occurred in beer in the 11th century, but it took until the 16th century for brewers in Britain to fully accept hops as part of everyday brewing. During this time, when both hopped beer and gruit were competing with each other, people generally spoke of gruit by calling it ale, while the word beer was reserved for the hopped versions. Lagers only arrived on the beer scene around 1840 when a brewer from Vienna named Anton Dreher developed the first true lager, called the Vienna lager. For years, Mr. Dreher had studied yeast and how they worked in beer, and although his understanding of them was not complete, he was able to isolate bottom fermenting yeast and create his Vienna lager entirely with that type of yeast, the first time such fermentation had happened for beer. During the 1830s, he visited many different breweries and often stole samples of beer and yeast while the brewers weren't watching him. Hiding the stolen yeast and beer in small flasks in his clothing made him nervous, so he had a hollow walking stick made with a valve on the end that allowed him to suck up beer at less risk of being noticed. Here's my last word as far as this beer style introduction goes. First of all, labels can be very deceiving as far as beer styles are concerned. Often a brewer calls a beer something like Golden Ale because he thinks it will be a good description for marketing purposes, but the beer inside could be a Belgian Triple or a Kolsch, two very different styles of beer. There's no law against naming a beer for the style it fits into or doesn't fit into, and that's okay. Brewers shouldn't be restricted to brewing or naming their beers for some arbitrary set of style guidelines. I appreciate style guidelines because it helps me to understand and explain how much wonderful diversity there is in the beer world. But I hope that we never come to a situation where brewers are compelled to follow style guidelines strictly. Styles should celebrate diversity, not restrict it. In my opinion, the best brewers are artists, and a true artist should never be concerned about coloring inside the lines. A true artist should be free to express themselves with their various ingredients and techniques in any manner that they choose. Thanks for joining me on this introduction to beer styles. I hope you'll go on to look at some of the other modules that we have that will go more in depth on particular beer styles. In the meantime, you may want to look at some of the source material that I looked at to prepare for this module. You can read a lot about style definitions at bjcp.org. There's a very good article at Wikipedia on beer style history, a great gruit story at gruitale.com, another Wikipedia story, this one on Anton Dreher at wikipedia.org,